Hello, people. Finished the book. Grant Takes Command. It's actually the third book that I've read by the same author, and this is part 2 of the classic Civil War study of General Ulysses S. Grant. I got a couple more by the same author, but I'm not sure that. I think I need a break from this author. He's pretty good. But he's like heavy on the politics. The book always ends with a big battle, and this book ends with, it ends with Lee's surrender. And I'm not sure if the South has officially surrendered at the end of this book, but it's pretty dramatic how it ends, with Lee and Grant, meeting and figuring out what to do with Grant's or Lee's soldiers and all of that. It's pretty cool. Lincoln gets assassinated at the end of the book. 492 pages. Today is Saturday. I actually finished this on Thursday, and I've only got 80 pages to go in the book that I'm reading right now, so I may be making another video either today or tomorrow. So let's get into my notes here. There's not too many notes. In the beginning of the book, Grant wants to capture Mobile, Alabama, but the troops that are in that area, Lincoln doesn't interfere with Grant too often. Lincoln and there's a guy named Stanton. Stanton's like the Secretary of War. They tell Grant that, he can't do this operation right now because they want Butler is the guy's name who commands the troops that would have attacked Mobile. They tell Grant that those troops are needed to go to Texas. Not that there's a big problem with Texas. Texas is part of the Confederacy, but they want the troops there because at this time this Maximilian fellow is in Mexico and there's French troops in Mexico. So really they want federal troops to make a showing along the border. And my note here says, nice, I had suspected that the Maximilian thing coincided with the American Civil War, but I was not sure. And then I write here that I could have just Googled this, but that's not the way I do things. And it's not the way I do things. Fuck Google. Not that I never use it, but I'd rather read to find out. Washington decides to make a show of force in Texas instead of taking Mobile, Alabama, so they can face down the French troops in Mexico. I believe that the French commander there, Maximilian, was not French, he was Austrian. I believe the French commander there was a guy named Bazaine, and Bazaine is pretty interesting. I have a biography of Bazaine that I read a couple of years ago. Just some stuff about Grant here. Obviously, this author really likes Grant. There's not much in here that would be considered critical of Grant. And there's a lot of people that write their impressions of Grant after they meet him. And one of the common things that you find in these impressions is Grant could enter a room, and especially if people didn't know what he looked like, they wouldn't even know that he had entered the room. He did not like to draw attention to himself. Grant had very little staff, unlike, compare him to McClellan. McClellan had this huge staff. Grant's uniform was nothing special. He was not a big talker. He did not like to do speeches. He's not an extrovert at all. But one of the things in the beginning of this book is Grant reminds me of a teenager out driving a car. I mean, when I was a kid, I was reckless as hell in a vehicle. And Grant was the same way if you got him on a horse. And not just on a horse, but if if he had a team and he was on a buggy, he would be the same way. He'd be going as fast as he can. And he does. He injures himself. And of course, everybody claims that he's drunk while he does that. But no, he wasn't drunk. And I have a one word on this note that says cotton. And throughout the whole thing, throughout the whole Civil War, people came from the North. They even got licensed by the federal government to go trade in cotton, but it just irritated Grant to no end. Grant would have rather just let the cotton set because they paid, people made fortunes going down south buying cotton and then taking it north or taking it even to England or to Canada and selling it for a lot more money. They literally made fortunes. But you couldn't just pay Southerners without them turning around and using that money for the war effort. And that's what Grant tried to stop. No front lines in this war. This war did not advance on a broad front. I mean, the federal forces took New Orleans, very early in the war. And sometimes when I'm reading about flanking maneuvers, especially around Richmond, because they kind of sat across from each other. There was a little bit of trench warfare there, and I'm reading about flanking maneuvers, and they're talking about Grant trying to flank Lee's left, and Grant's troops moving north, and I'm like, what the hell? He just instantly assumed that the federal troops would always be facing south, but they weren't. All kinds of armies were in operation. There was raiders all over the place, and in between these armies, there was like a no man's land. I go a long, long ways without a note here. Right before the stalemate before Richmond is ended, there's like a Petersburg or something that covers the approaches to Richmond. Grant knows that it's going to end, and Lincoln actually pays a visit. Lincoln is there, which seems like a dangerous thing for a president to do. So I've got top of 305. A few days ago, we were sitting in front of the general's tent when there appeared very suddenly before us a long, lank-looking personage, dressed all in black and looking very much like a boss undertaker. It was the president. He said after shaking hands with us all, "I just thought I would jump aboard a boat and come down and see you. I don't expect I can do any good, and in fact I'm afraid I may do harm, but I'll put myself under your orders, and if you find me doing anything wrong, just send me right away." General Grant informed him bluntly that he would certainly do that. The old fellow remained with us till the next day and told stories all the time. He did not ask and said he did not want to know Grant's plans. On the whole, he behaved very well. The black troops received him most enthusiastically, grinning from ear to ear and displaying an amount of ivory terrible to behold. Then I've got a note here that says, the mine. There was a big stalemate in front of this Petersburg, I forget what it was now. But the Federals, they dig a mine and they put a bunch of TNT in there, and they blow up a portion of the rebel trenches and part of a fort. And then they attack. I mean, that's the idea. They did this in World War I, and then they attack. But when Grant was with the Army of the West, he had all his favorite generals. He knew who he could trust. When they made him lieutenant general in command of all the forces, they moved him to the Army of the Potomac. And this Army of the Potomac, he had a lot of shitty officers. And when they blew up this mine, the officers were not there leading from the front. They didn't. The troops actually ran right into the crater that was made by the mine. Yes, they captured the trenches that were right there, but they blew the whole thing. They fucked that up so bad. It was incredible. Uh, Lincoln is there when Grant smashes Lee's army. Yeah, I'm kind of reading this in reverse order. I haven't even read about Gettysburg yet. Haven't read about the Bull Run battles. The maps are screwed up. There's no front lines, no broad front. The meeting between Grant and Lee is very dramatic. Lee comes there in this beautiful, sparkling uniform. He's got his sword on. Grant walks into the room with a mud-spattered uniform. His pants are actually tucked into his boots. I don't know much about Lee, so I can't contrast their personalities. Soon after Lee's surrender, Lincoln is assassinated. Grant had actually been scheduled to be with Lincoln at Ford's Theater, but his wife is the one that made him beg off from that, so he was not there. There was a big, after Lincoln was assassinated, Grant and everybody, they were just outraged, and they wanted to arrest Confederate politicians. They thought it was a big conspiracy, and a week later, everyone kind of relaxed, and they realized that it was not a conspiracy. I probably need to read more about that too. They only devoted a few pages to it here. That's about it. Thank you. I got another book that I'm almost done with. Thanks.